This is a content warning. In this episode, we discuss sensitive topics such as gender and sexual violence, abuse, and depictions of oppression. Welcome to Greenwich and the Environment. I'm Diva Wareing, your host, ready to take you on a journey through the heart of creativity, culture, research, and sustainability at Greenwich. So, whether you're passionate about the planet or just curious about the hidden forces shaping our world, stick around. This is where sustainability meets creativity. Let's get started. With me in the studio today is Professor Stacy Banwell. Stacy is a professor of criminology at the University of Greenwich. Her research interests include conflicts-related sexual and reproductive violence, gender, climate change and atrocity crimes, and multi-species justice. Stacey is also part of an EU Horizon UKRI project called Transformative Change for Biodiversity and Equity, where she is evaluating sustainability transformations through legal pathways such as rights of nature, ecocide, and restorative justice. Welcome, Stacey.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. So excited for our conversation.
Yeah, me too.
So we're here today to discuss your book, The War Against Non-Human Animals, a Non-Speciesist Understanding of Gendered Reproductive Violence. Wow, exciting. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the research, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You grew up in Wales, in rural Wales. How was it growing up there? And how did growing up in a place like that impact your career?
Thank you, that's a great question. So I'm a woman of mixed ethnic identity. So I was the only mixed race child in my household. So all of my siblings, my adoptive siblings, were white. All of my school friends, my classmates were white. So it was quite challenging growing up in rural North Wales in those sorts of environments, both at school and at home, being the only person of colour. So that was difficult. I did experience discrimination and racism. And I think those early experiences then informed the sort of research that I went on to do. So I was particularly interested then in looking at injustice, discrimination and racism within my research. So that kind of informed the intersectional approach that I took with my work. So I was particularly interested in using those early experiences to look at violence and victimisation within the home, so within the private sphere, but also within the public sphere. And that informed the teaching that I've done at the University of Greenwich, but also some of the empirical research that I've done. So I've looked at violence and victimisation within the sex industry, within the conflict zone, within the animal industrial complex. And so, yeah, it's kind of informed that trajectory, if you like, that I'm really interested in looking at harm and suffering against marginalised communities, and more recently looking at, the impact of violence and victimisation on non-human animals. So I really think those early childhood experiences of those things informed what I was particularly interested in looking at throughout my career.
Wow, that's so interesting. I didn't know that about you, Stacey. Do you mind just really quickly explaining animal industrial complex?
So that can refer to lots of things. I'm looking particularly at factory farming, but other people will look at it to look at perhaps we think about the animal industrial complex, we might think about zoos, for example, and other industries where we're talking about the confinement of non-human animals. But for me, I'm particularly looking at industrialised animal agriculture. That's my particular focus. But other people, Twine, for example, have looked at it in relation to any industry where you're looking at the relationship between the exploitation of non-human animals within capitalist societies. So there might be lots of other examples. And that's the main focus when you say the animal industrial complex, is this idea of the commodification, the exploitation of non-human animals within those sorts of societies. But my particular focus is industrialised animal agriculture.
Right. And you use the term non-human animals instead of animals. Can you explain a little bit why you decided to choose that terminology?
Yeah, because I think there's a bit of big debates around that. And I think for me, I'm a really strong believer in how you approach something. You can turn it from a negative to a positive. So I think people have argued that saying non-human animals is a negative because you're still retaining that term human. But I think what I was trying to demonstrate was that we are that non-human animals and humans are still animals, but it's important to acknowledge that that we can have a positive connotation, say they're non-human animals. So you're still retaining the idea that humans are animals.
A part of it. We're kind of all like one.
So I just wanted to have that distinction and try to have it in a less negative connotation surrounding it, because I know some people really struggle with that, and I think the alternatives are more problematic. So for me, I like the idea of they are non-human animals, and just the idea that humans are animals as well. So that was my thinking.
Oh no, that makes a lot of sense, and I completely understand that. So I guess let's talk about the reason why you're here. Your book. In your book, The War Against Non-Human Animals, a Non-Speciesist Understanding of Gendered Reproductive Violence, as the title suggests, you state that you believe that we're at war with animals. I'm sure some farmers and others in the industry wouldn't think that they're at war with their animals. So can you just explain what you mean by this and why you chose to frame the relationship between humans and non-human animals in this way?
Yeah, brilliant. That's a great question. I think it's really important to be clear at the outset that in the book, when I use the term war, I'm not using it as a metaphor. But I think before I get into explaining what I mean by that, I think it's really important to give a bit of context. And it goes back to your question about what do we mean by the animal industrial complex. So as I said, I'm talking about industrialised or factory farming. So in the context of the US, what we're talking about is concentrated feeding operations, CAFOs, or mega farms in the UK. And so when we think about CAFOs, these facilities need to hold thousands of non-human animals. So they need to hold, for example, 125,000 chickens, 82,000 laying hens, 2,500 pigs, and 700 dairy cows or 1,000 beef cattle. Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it? And then if you think about the UK, the mega farms that's how we refer to them, they need to detain more than 40,000 birds, 2,000 pigs, or 750 breeding sows. So that's what I'm talking about. That's the context. Now, Wadiwell wrote a book called The War Against Animals. And following him, I frame the violence as biopolitical in nature. And what I mean by that is that this is a war that is about life and death, because the industrialised killing of all of those animals that I just listed also requires the industrialised reproduction. And I think I'm going to draw on Wadiwell here because I think he sums it up really neatly when he says, quote, "The scale by which we kill and harm animals would seem to confirm that our mainstay relationship with animals is combative, or at least focused upon producing harm and death. Factory farming and industrialised slaughter technologies enable a monstrous deployment of violence and extermination." So according to Wadiwell in his book, The War Against Animals, war is a phenomenon of mass or corporate organised violence that is about domination. And we can trace this interpretation of war to Karl von Clausewitz, who was a military theorist. And in his book on war, he described war as an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfil our will. So within this analysis of war, we're focusing on the objective of the violence, which is complete domination, rather than the means used to wage war. So if we accept this interpretation of war, as Wadiwell suggests, we can conclude that we are engaged in a war against non-human animals. So in my book, I accept both of these perspectives. I argue that, yes, we're talking about a war that is biopolitical in nature, and it also involves complete domination. However, I try to move beyond rhetoric and kind of philosophical reasoning in the book to try and look at the practical ways that we can protect non-human animals from the violences that take place during this war. So what I do in the book is I offer an original analysis of international humanitarian law. So international humanitarian law, put very simply, is about alleviating the impact of armed conflict by protecting civilians and restricting the means and methods used during armed conflict. So international humanitarian law recognises two types of armed conflict. One is international armed conflict and the other is non-international armed conflict. And it's important to state that in the book I'm talking about non-international armed conflict. And I go into a lot of detail in the book about why this is the case. But for our purposes today, if we focus on the criteria that needs to be met for non-international armed conflict, and this is laid down by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they say that we decide when something classifies as non-international armed conflict on a case-by-case basis, and we take certain things into account. So the criteria that needs to be met includes things like the intensity of the violence, the duration, the gravity, the weapons used, and the number of casualties incurred. So then in the book, and I did debate about including statistics about the number of non-human animals who are killed, but I think in order to demonstrate how what we're talking about, falls under that definition of non-international armed conflict, I do include those figures. So again, just to reiterate, we're talking here about, the gravity of the violence, the number of casualties, and the intensity of the violence. And if we look at Viva, a vegan charity, their latest figures tell us that in the UK, 1.2 billion animals are killed every year in the UK. Over 1 billion fish, 4.4 billion shellfish are killed every year. And in terms of the non-human animals that I'm referring to in the book, annually over 1 billion chickens are killed, 9 million pigs, and 2.7 million cattle are slaughtered in the UK. And globally, 83 billion land animals are slaughtered every year.
Wow.
So it's a lot.
That is a lot.
So what I do in the book, then I say, if we take that information into account, I think we can revise our existing understanding of non-international armed conflict. And this is how I frame the war against non-human animals. It is a war that involves violence committed by government and non-governmental groups against non-armed, non-combatants, i.e. non-human animals, within a state. And it was within this war, it's important to state that non-human animals are reduced to the status of property, and it is their status as things, this is what I argue in the book, rather than persons, that legitimizes the scale and impunity with which this violence is perpetrated. And then one final comment that I talk about in the book, I refer to Macquarie and Warclate's book, A Criminology of War, which is a really fascinating book. And in that, they talk about the feasibility of developing this concept of a criminology of war. And in that book, they draw on Jameson, who says, what it comes down to is not so much a question of what we call it, but rather it's a question of how the study of war is achieved and imagined. So I imagine the study of war to include non-human animals or a carnist battlefield. War in this context is based on my reformulation of non-international armed conflict so we can accommodate the situation of non-human animals. I think we can extend some of the work that we have in criminology that talks about the victimology of non-human animals to talk about the victimology of non-human animals within war. And within this study of war, I think we need to, we're recognising non-human animals as sentient beings and as a group who should be afforded legal personhood. So there's a lot there, and I've spoken a lot about that, but I think it's important just to lay out that the book does go beyond using war as a metaphor, that it looks at the practical applications, looks at the criteria that needs to be met for something to qualify as an international or non-international armed conflict. And then I go through in detail how and why I think the animal industrial complex is an example of that.
Yeah, and I think you break it down really well in the book. So in the book, in chapters 2 and 3, you talk about both female and male gendered reproductive violence. And I didn't know until I read your book that until 2021, male piglets were being castrated just to preserve the taste. I was like, what? So can you explain a little bit about what gender violence occurs in the egg, dairy and meat industries?
Yeah, of course. It is shocking, isn't it, that case? And as I said in the book, it was quite difficult to find some updated information about that because I think there were ideas, there were proposals to ban that, but I don't think that has happened. But as you say, yeah, it's really shocking, isn't it, that it's about preserving and getting rid of the taste and the smell. It's something so... it's just, it's that's just one example. So yeah, as you say in the book, I look at gendered reproductive violence, and in case people aren't familiar, when I say reproductive violence, I'm talking about violence that is directed against a person's reproductive autonomy, or violence that's directed against an individual based on their reproductive capabilities. And that was used to talk about human populations. Ecofeminists such as Kelty Huber uses the term reproductive violence to refer to the systematic exploitation, physical and mental violence, as well as trauma that's experienced by farmed animals when their reproductive systems are controlled within the animal industrial complex. So the examples that I look at in the book around gendered reproductive violence include rape, forced pregnancy, forced separation of mother and child, genital violence, forced ejaculation and castration. And based on my argument that we are currently engaged in a war against non-human animals, I do frame these as examples of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I also frame them as the expressions and consequences of reproductive violence. And one of the key themes here is that I'm arguing that persons capable of becoming pregnant or persons capable of procreation through semen production are victims of these crimes. So if we think about the dairy industry, as I argue in the book, the production of milk is the result of the repeated rape and forcible impregnation of dairy cows. And this is done through non-consensual invasive methods of penetration. And this includes the use of what is referred to in the industry as the rape rack. And this is a device that forcibly restrains the cow while she is forcibly impregnated.
Sorry, can you just say that again? What is this, the rape rack?
It's called the rape rack, yeah. And it's interesting. I've watched, it comes up in the documentary that I watched, but also when you draw on some ecofeminist work who did empirical research with workers, it is actually used colloquially. It is sort of used by people who work within the industry. So there's something sort of, interesting or problematic going on there where this is just the phrase that is used, which, and interestingly, as Gillespie talks about in her work, it's almost used as a euphemism by workers, but actually it isn't a euphemism because that is literally
that's what's happening.
That's what's happening, that the cow is restrained, they are forcibly impregnated, either, artificially or by a bull, and the term is referred to as recto-vaginal rape. So yes, I won't go into detail here, but I do talk in the book about how that process happens, and what I think the important thing to think about here when we're talking about this invasive, non-consensual artificial insemination is that 80% of dairy cows in North America and Europe are subject to this forced impregnation through artificial insemination. We're talking about gendered violence here. So what I do in the book is talk about not just the kind of the physical element of this reproductive violence, but also then the forced separation of the mother and calf, which happens within the first 12 hours of the calf being born. So at least 90% of calves are taken from their mothers. And, the literature tells us, and the research demonstrates that cows will sort of bellow for days after losing, after the calf is forcibly removed. So that's another element that I wanted to get across, the gendered harm of that procedure. And they're removed so that the milk can be retained for human consumption. So we're within the dairy industry. So there I talk about this artificial insemination through artificial insemination of the semen. Now that comes from the bull. And in terms of the experiences of bulls, their semen is collected. It's a forced ejaculation. In the book, I talk about the different methods that are used, and that can happen 2 to 3 times a week or as much as 2 to 3 times a day on the day that semen is collected. And that can either be through, forcibly, this is done through forcible ejaculation, either through the use of an artificial vagina or kind of electro-ejaculation. So that's what I talk about in terms of the dairy industry, looking at how dairy cows and bulls are both subject to those acts of reproductive violence. In the meat industry, sows also go through a similar process where they are forcibly impregnated. This is through the use of an insemination rod. And that again is repeated. And again, we have a similar situation where the piglets are removed. Normally, that weaning process should take 3 months, but it often happens within 3 weeks. And it's a similar process where the sow is then, repeatedly impregnated through this artificial insemination. And then again, in the meat industry, male calves are castrated. And this goes back to what you were saying, Diva, about the piglets. This typically happens when calves are about 6 months old, and this is to improve the marketability of that meat because it tastes better and it sells better in the market. And then I also talk about reproductive violence within the egg industry, where hens can undergo forced molting, and this is a process that involves withholding food for prolonged times because it increases their production of eggs. There's also genetic manipulation that goes on in terms of interfering with the reproductive bodies of hen laying eggs in order to increase the production of eggs. And in the book I do talk about the dairy and egg industries and what we're talking about in terms of the intensification of factory farming. It is worth mentioning that in the egg industry, in a similar way to the dairy industry and the meat industries, where you have chicks that are removed, what happens in the egg industry, which is slightly different, is that male chicks, because they don't produce eggs and are seen as, they're not valuable, they will be killed. And it is estimated, so research by Animal Equality and Davidson tells us that at least 260 million male chicks are killed annually in the US because they are not seen as needed or valuable to the egg industry. So that's what I talk about in the book. And as I say, I frame those as examples of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and yet as acts of gendered reproductive violence that these non-human animals are subject to within this war.
Yeah. And you just mentioned then the documentary Cow. I also saw that. That's the Andrea Arnold documentary. It's so good. For anyone who's not been to see it, 100% go and watch it. I already kind of knew a little bit about the dairy industry, but I think it just really brings home that emotional side for what actually happens in the dairy industry. Yeah. And I'm not going to say any more about it because go and watch it, but it's great. And you also mention in the book another film called The Herd. So how do you think that films and other art forms like these can help to bring awareness to these issues?
Thanks, Steve. That's a really good question. I think they can be important. I think, interestingly, in thinking about the value and the impact that they can have, it's interesting that some research has been done. So, for example, Pabian et al. I'm going to talk here about, because I think a lot of people may be familiar with the documentary Cowspiracy. Some research has been done with a group of students comparing their response to watching Cowspiracy and watching another documentary, Planet Earth, to see whether, what is the impact of watching these sorts of documentaries. Does it change people's attitudes towards things such as sustainability, meat eating, the impacts of the meat industry? And the article is called 90 Minutes to Reduce One's Intention to Eat Meat, a preliminary experimental investigation of the effects of watching Cowspiracy on the intention to reduce meat consumption. And it's really interesting because this is they found that it did have an impact, that people did compared to watching the other documentary, Planet Earth, it did have an impact on people's views around the impact of continuing to consume meat. However, there has been another piece written that argues that some of the claims of that documentary were not true, that they've overestimated or exaggerated the impact of the meat industry in terms of, things around sustainability and climate change. So I think if documentaries are going to have an impact, and interestingly, it is suggested that at least 37% of current animal activists or advocates became advocates after watching a documentary. So I think there is evidence to suggest that it can have an impact. I just think we need to ensure that the information people are getting in those documentaries is authentic and accurate, because what you don't want is for people to feel that they've been duped or tricked, or that their decision to not consume meat or to embrace various other examples of sustainability were based on false information. So I think they're good, but it was interesting just having a little look at this and seeing, yes, the positive impacts, but also what problems may arise if the information isn't correct.
Yeah.
My suggestion for people would be that podcasts are a good way to get information. I'm not just promoting this one. I'm not just saying that because I'm on a podcast, but having done and listened to Think Like a Vegan and the Knowing Animals podcast, I think there are other ways in which people can get information, because they're often based on research that people have done, publications, and so they might be other ways in which people can
That's good to know.
get more information.
Podcasts, guys.
There you go.
So you've spoken quite a few times about legal personhood. Can you explain to us what legal personhood is?
Yeah. Okay, so really simply, legal personhood means granting non-human animals fundamental rights such as bodily integrity, bodily liberty, and freedom. And as we speak now, non-human animals are treated as legal things rather than legal persons. And this is reflected in their property status. And interestingly, in the book, I talk about various organisations that are trying to kind of grant non-human animals legal personhood. So one of the most visible organisations that are advocating for this is the Non-Human Rights Project in the US. And their goal, and this is on their website, is to change the common law status of great apes, elephants, dolphins and whales from mere things, which lack the capacity to possess any legal right, to legal persons who possess these fundamental rights that I've just mentioned, which is bodily liberty and integrity. And in the book, in my own work, I link this idea or this discussion around legal personhood to ideas of speciesism and sentience. So we think about speciesism. What we're talking about here is this perceived human superiority over non-human animals, or discrimination based on species membership. And so I think it's really interesting if we think about Danai has written a really interesting chapter called The Rights of Sentient Beings. And she talks about non-speciesists, or people who describe themselves as, not being non-speciesist. And these are people, and I would class myself as one of these people, who reject this kind of human-based criteria for the rights of people and argue that non-human animals and non-human phenomena, or any being that has sentience, should be afforded these particular rights. And Danaya goes further and talks about this idea of a non-speciesist law. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and I explore the reality and practicalities of this book, is under non-speciesist law, it would be illegal to hold non-human animals captive, because we would be giving them liberty, freedom and bodily integrity. So under this idea of non-speciesist law, we would be removing all non-human animals from captivity. And I think it's worth just mentioning that, we're talking about legal personhood here. We do have some legislation in the UK, so the Animal Welfare Sentience Act, which does recognise animal sentience and does talk about welfare. But I think what I'm trying to get across in the book is that whilst we have lots of focus on issues around speciesism, sentience and welfare, legal personhood goes just that bit further and is arguing that they should be freed from captivity, that they should have legal rights and protections. And in the context of the book, I'm arguing that if we see non-human animals as civilians, then they should be protected from, under international humanitarian law, they should be protected from the violences of the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that I talk about.
Yeah, and you also say in the book that legal personhood isn't just for people. So it's for companies, it's for ships, there's been rivers, and I actually saw the other day that a mountain's been granted legal personhood. So I mean, I guess there's not that much of an argument to be like, no, they can't have legal personhood because it's just for people, because it's not just for people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We have precedent of giving non-human phenomena legal personhood. I think some of the concern is that what are we saying when we grant non-human animals legal personhood? What rights would we be giving them? And the thing that I make clear in the book is that we're not saying that they would be human persons, we're saying that they would be legal persons, and that's a different thing. And what we're saying ultimately is that, that they would be, we wouldn't use them for food, entertainment, clothing. We wouldn't see them as resources. They would have certain, these freedoms that I keep referring to. Yeah. So I think it's important that, exactly as you say, that we recognise that certain phenomena has been granted legal personhood, but also that what we're not saying is that we want non-human animals to be treated the same as humans. They would be specific rights that relate to their particular situation.
Yeah. So in your book, you include human case studies, such as slavery and violence against women, but you make it very clear not to draw crude comparisons between the two. Instead, you decided to talk about shared oppression sources for both animals and humans. Can you explain what some of these shared sources are?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think it's really important, isn't it? Because I've mentioned a few times now that I talk about war crimes and crimes against humanity in the book. So I make it clear that even though I have included those cases of intrahuman violence, that I'm not saying that they're the same. I talk about shared sources of oppression, but I think just before I get into that, it might just be helpful to give people a sense of work that engages in those sorts of comparisons, and then explain why my research is different. So they are called dreaded comparisons, and Marjorie Spiegel published a book called The Dreaded Comparisons, Human and Animal Slavery. This was published in 1988. And as the book suggests, it is about drawing parallels between the oppression of Black people and the oppression of non-human animals. There are other books that engage in these direct comparisons. So we have Eternal Treblinka, that was written by Charles Patterson, and we also have The Holocaust and the Handmaid's Tale by Karen Davis. And they do the sort of this direct and crude comparison between humans and non-human animals. But I obviously didn't want to do that. What I wanted to demonstrate in the book is that it's more helpful and much less divisive if we look at what are the shared sources of oppression between humans who are subject to these acts of reproductive violence and non-human animals who are subject to those acts of reproductive violence. So the three categories, or the three sources that I look at that run throughout the book, are racism, sexism, and speciesism. So in terms of racism, what I found was throughout all of the different case studies, both human and non-human animals, is this idea that race designates certain people as inferior, as sub, and as non-human, and it's this kind of designation of people as animal-like, as outside of the human, that informs the violence that is inflicted on them. And that was something that I found within the case studies of intrahuman violence, and obviously within, when we think about non-human animals, it's the fact that they have been designated as less than human that I argue is the driving force of the violence that they experience. So race, racism, dehumanization, animalization were all themes that run across both. In terms of gender and sexism, again, if we go back to this idea of reproductive violence and the way in which certain bodies are targeted, here I was looking at this ability to procreate, reproduction, to give birth. And that was the driving force of the violence that both human and non-human animals are victims of within the examples that I was looking at. So I was really interested in this idea of biological motherhood and that ability to reproduce, and how that is a driving force. And I think it's really interesting, we can draw on, I really think this summarises it neatly, by Byrne, who wrote a really interesting article back in 1999 talking about non-speciesist criminology. And he says sexism and speciesism operate not in opposition to each other, but in tandem. Interspecies sexual assault is the product of a masculinity that sees women and animals as objects that can be controlled, manipulated and exploited. And that's what I was getting at with the examples that I was looking at, that it was driven by a particular type of masculinity that was seeing both female, human and non-human animals as there to be controlled and manipulated. Importantly, in the book, I also look at male reproductive bodies and the way in which they're targeted, again, based on their ability to reproduce. And then speciesism was another theme that runs throughout the book. And here I think it's important to think through this idea that it's not just non-human animals who are impacted by this idea of speciesism, because as I argue in the book, when we think about speciesism, we're talking about human exceptionalism, which is based on certain humans. So in the book I argue that this is based on the kind of white heterosexual male, which means that other categories of human along race, gender, class lines are also excluded. So speciesism shouldn't just be about how we think non-human animals are exploited or subject to the violences that I talk about in the book. It's also certain humans that fall outside of what we class as kind of, this exceptional human. So they were the three themes that I argued were the driving forces for all of the examples that I looked at. And hopefully in doing that, I was trying to avoid these kind of dreaded comparisons and making those crude direct links, because I just don't think that's helpful. It's quite divisive, I think.
Yeah, and I think going with the sources it's just very clear, and it makes a lot of sense to do that. And I think you're right. I think it removes that divisiveness. So what do you think the consequences are for continuing to use animals in the way that we do? It's a hot topic and something you do mention in the book, but how do you think that the animal industrial complex affects human health?
Thanks, Steve. That's a really important question. I think that was one of the things that I really wanted to get across as well, in terms of not just describing these violences, but really trying to demonstrate the impact on both human and non-human animals. And so, as well as talking about things that perhaps people are more familiar with, say, for example, like air pollution and the impact of greenhouse gas emissions, one of the things that I found particularly interesting and that I explore in the book was this idea of antibiotic resistance. And there's been sort of concern that because of it's referred to as the overuse of antibiotics within the animal industrial complex, but I think perhaps misuse is a better term. But because of this misuse of antibiotics, there is concern that we're entering into this post-antibiotic era. So we could be entering into an era where we just don't have access to life-saving antibiotics. But let me just go back a little bit. So this idea of the misuse of antibiotics, this is based on the fact that non-human animals are given, there's an increased use of antibiotics for non-human animals in order to promote growth, but also to curtail disease and illness that happens within these confined spaces. If we think back to what we said at the beginning in terms of the number of non-human animals who are contained.
And this is because of the conditions that they're in.
Exactly, yeah. If you think that just the scale of what we're talking about in terms of factory farming, and so they're all packed in, they're all in these crowded, confined cells in order to prevent illness and disease, but also to meet the demands of the meat, egg and dairy industries. These antibiotics are given to non-human animals for those reasons. And then the problem with that is that it then means that this can lead to drug resistance bacteria. This bacteria then is transferred to humans, and then that leads to kind of antibiotic resistance infections within the human population. And some of the sort of stark predictions have suggested that if we have this inability to this antibiotic resistance within humans, we could be looking at 10 million deaths globally by 2050 if we don't sort of address this issue and reduce the use of antibiotics within the animal industrial complex. So there are real kind of implications to this misuse or overuse, whichever term. I think misuse is a better phrase, because it's, if we didn't have all of these animals packed in, we wouldn't be needing to use the antibiotics for the reasons that we are.
And is it that the antibiotics are used across most of these large scale farms?
Yes, yeah. In the book I talk about there are plans in Europe to reduce the use of antibiotics. So there are definitely proposals and laws being put into place, certainly in Europe, but I think globally this is still a huge issue.
Wow, it's a massive problem then.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I feel like talking about change in the food industry, talking about veganism, or talking about reducing meat consumption can be such a tricky and sensitive topic to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it's even possible for us to implement legal personhood for animals at all, like either now or in decades to come?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think sometimes when you're writing a book, it's easy to lay things down and not have to really think about the practicalities of doing this. And so interestingly, since writing the book and having done various sort of talks or had questions about this, I've had to really think through some of these things. So work to secure legal personhood is ongoing. Interestingly, there have been 27 cases that have been brought before the court, and in an interesting article, Franceschini has written about that in detail. So if people are interested, that's a really interesting article called Animal Personhood, The Quest for Recognition. And in that, she goes into a lot of detail about these 27 cases, why they got to the stage they did within the courts, why they might have ultimately been rejected. I've also been part of some petitions that have been used by the Non-Human Rights Project that have been presented to the Supreme Court. And whilst we haven't been successful yet in granting non-human animals legal personhood, really importantly, certain judges have dissented decisions, and judges are now some judges anyway are sort of recognising that whilst they may not be comfortable recognising non-human animals as legal persons, they have recognised that they're more than just things or more than just property.
So it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. But I think for me, having done research as part of the project that you mentioned at the outset, the Transformative Change for Biodiversity and Equity, I've been looking at rights of nature, this new phenomenon which is sort of rooted in this kind of idea of earth jurisprudence, which is about granting legal personhood to ecosystems, which would give ecosystems the right to defend themselves against environmental degradation or anthropogenic interference such as climate change. And I think that might be the way forward. There's a really interesting case that people might want to look up where this has been used, because rights of nature tends to focus on ecosystems or species of non-human animals that are endangered. But there's a really interesting case of Estrilla the woolly monkey. I don't know if you're familiar with this case.
No.
So I've only just become familiar with it. It happened in 2022. So this is a case of a monkey who was poached, was stolen, taken from the wild, then as part of the illegal wildlife trade was sold. She was then held captive. Well, she was then held by an individual, Anna Babano, who had her for 18 years, so had her in her home, sort of treated her like a child. The authorities were finally made aware of this monkey living with this woman, and then she was removed. She was placed in a zoo. Anna then tried to petition this imprisonment of her child, I guess. At that point, Estrilla had actually died. Oh. But the point for us, which I think is really interesting, is that this all happened in Ecuador. So the Constitutional Court of Ecuador has used this case to combine this idea of animal rights and rights of nature, and have argued that Estrilla, as a wild non-human animal, has the right, is a subject of rights, and that those rights include having her own natural habitat. So this is a really interesting case. Franceschini and Stilt have written a really interesting article on it called Naturalised Rights of Animals and Animalised Rights of Nature. If you look up this case, there's lots of information about it. But I think for me, it's the key issue is that it's this combining of the rights of nature movement with this idea of the rights of non-human animals, and moving beyond seeing it as about endangered or species of animals to individual animals. And I think in non-human animals, and if we think about the animal industrial complex, where lots of land is used in order to facilitate factory farming, so we've got deforestation, and we think about all of the species that are killed as a result of that. I think there is this connection we can make between rights of nature and protecting all of those species, but also arguing we think about the harm and welfare of all of those non-human animals who are impacted within the animal industrial complex. So I think, for me, the rights of nature might just be the way forward with some of this legal personhood. With that approach and this particular case. I think so. And I think this is such a landmark case with this particular monkey that it's huge that the court made that decision. So I think, watch this space really and see whether rights of nature is the way we grant non-human animals legal personhood.
Oh, and has your understanding of human and non-human animal relationships changed or possibly deepened whilst researching and writing this book?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, it's changed a little bit, but I think going back to what I was just saying, I think the main thing for me, having written the book and stepped back from it, has been thinking about the feasibility of all of this. Like what does it look like? What if we banned factory farming? What would this look like? Where do the non-human animals go? And interestingly, this has been something that in 2019, Senator Cory Booker did introduce the Farm System Reform Act, which was about trying to ban factory farming by 2040. So there is sort of legislation, there are proposals around this. So I think for me, it's about, what would this look like if we were to release all non-human animals from captivity? What would happen to those animals? What are the alternatives? I've been looking into the cultivated meat industry, which is really interesting, but also thinking through, because one of my arguments is that we go back to this idea of industrialized reproduction of non-human animals, and 100 billion animals are born each year, born and bred to be killed and consumed. If we didn't have that industrialised reproduction, we wouldn't have that
meat or something.
Yeah, we wouldn't have that many non-human animals. But then, equally, if we think about all of the non-human animals, all the species that I've just mentioned that are killed as a result of deforestation, they would now be alive. They wouldn't die. So where would we house? So there are I guess the point I'm trying to get at is there are lots of things to think about in terms of the viability. And I think that's where I've been going, is looking at, well, what would it mean? Where would the non-human animals go? Would we be looking at more species of non-human animals surviving because they're not being killed as part of the animal industrial complex? The other, I suppose the biggest development in my research has been thinking about this idea of animal ecocide. So we're all familiar with this idea of ecocide, which is a crime. It's this proposal to criminalise destruction of the earth, and in that we have definitions of the environment. What I've argued is that perhaps we need to rethink that definition of the environment and think about the impact of non-human animals of destruction of the earth. And so I've been looking at exploring this idea of animal ecocide, looking at what is the impact of climate change as a result of industrialised animal agriculture, and thinking about why don't we try and introduce the law of animal ecocide.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm going, to trying to think through the practicalities of some of it, and again, as ever, introducing more laws.
Sounds great. I guess my next question will be, your book raises important ethical questions about humans' responsibility towards non-human animals, and in the book you emphasise a call to action for readers. What are some of the first steps individuals can take to combat the war against non-human animals on a personal or a societal level? Is it reducing eating meat? Is it encouraging lab-grown meat?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of those things. I also think it's about, and I think it's really important for me to sort of say this and make sure this is clear to people, that also thinking about who are the people that work in those industries and what is the impact on them. Because obviously I'm talking about the war against non-human animals. At the outset, you talked about farmers and, people involved in the industry and how they might respond to this. So one of the things that I do in the book is sort of talk about the impact on factory workers, slaughterhouse workers, all of those individuals who are involved in this really difficult, painful, I think it's described as dirty work. So I think that might, there are ways in which people can reduce and switch to plant-based diets, but also maybe familiarising ourselves with the impact on workers and thinking about viable alternatives to people who work within those industries. So thinking about, and there's some really interesting research and articles about people who've transitioned out of the meat and dairy industries towards plant-based industries and mushroom growing and things. So I think yes, we can do the research and look at and switch to plant-based diets, but I think for people to get to that stage, it might require doing this research, watching some of these documentaries, listening to some of these podcasts, but perhaps thinking about, the impact on not just non-human animals, but the people working within those industries. I think if people can engage with that, it might help to then switch to plant-based diets. And also one of the things that I talk about in the book is think about what is your end goal, because there's some really interesting research about, is your focus on greenhouse gas emissions? Is your focus on chemicals? Is your focus on packaging? And those sorts of questions will determine, for example, which plant-based milk you decide to adopt. Are you concerned about water use? So I think it's for people to think about what is their end goal here, and that will help you to make decisions about what plant-based alternatives you engage with. So I found that research really helpful for people to look at and help drive their decision making.
Yeah, and I guess it's a behaviour change. Like, is it like a step-by-step? Like, because I feel like, I don't eat meat and dairy either. And I feel like anytime there comes up with that conversation, there's always like a little bit of a pushback. And I think my approach to it has always been to try to be like, okay, well, maybe like, I try not to push my opinions on anyone about my dietary requirements. But I feel like being like, oh, well, why don't you do meatless Mondays or change to oat milk or something like that, or fava beans, which is a big shout for me. I love fava beans. So how do you think, like, just doing tiny little behaviour changes, do you think that would help?
Yeah, and I think sometimes, it's interesting because people are divided on this again, and a lot of this stuff is very divisive, isn't it? I think some people just think, no, you just have to sort of transition and become fully vegan. What I try and do with people is, in terms of when we go out to eat, I sort of always go to vegan places. One of the things that most of us will hear is that people say, but I couldn't give up cheese. Yeah. So there's an amazing vegan cheesemonger in London, and I sort of send those bits of information to people. So I think sometimes it's just providing not just information of the alternatives, but taking people to places where there's some amazing vegan food. When we have events here at the university, having those as plant-based. Yeah. So I think sometimes it's just introducing people to those foods so that people, because I think people have misconceptions about what being a vegan means, what 100%. The food is. So that's how I've also been trying to do it, is like you just introduce people to it, not just sort of here's the research, listen to that, watch that, here's some vegan food, here's some amazing vegan restaurants.
And it's going to sound cheesy, but celebrate the veggies, like vegetables and mushrooms can taste amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
So I think that's how I've, went particularly around, when it comes to sort of just giving people information and just saying, no, try this, like try that cheese, or try that restaurant.
Yeah.
So that I think helps. But I think, if we're being realistic, for some people it will have to be this kind of a slow transition. And I appreciate that not everybody will, like we have in London. We're so lucky with the amount of options that we have. So I do appreciate that for some people it may be a bit harder. But there are books out there. I was given a book around vegan travel, which was really helpful. Not only does it give you information about...
I think I have that same book.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? It's not just about like which vegan cities there are, but it's actually just got like how you can... things you can take with you, and so I think stuff like that helps, because that again can be a barrier for people thinking, I'm travelling to this city or this country, what am I going to do? And it's got some really helpful, even I always forget to do it, but there's a little badge you can print out that has say if you go to Japan and it has it written, I do not eat meat, egg or dairy, or things like that.
Which is so helpful.
Yeah, so I think
like
that helps as well.
Yeah.
I think if people, because that's another thing, isn't it? It's not just about where you live and accessing those things. I think there's a real concern about travel, and so there are books out there that help with those sorts of things.
And one thing I've noticed as a tourist going to places like this, like before when I used to eat, everything and now, is I find better restaurants, because I feel like as a tourist, you go to the tourist areas and then you go to the tourist trap restaurants. But when you don't eat the stuff, like the generic stuff that everyone can eat, you have to go that extra mile and do your own research and find those vegan restaurants. And then you're like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah, you see much more. It's really funny, actually, because when we went to the American Society of Criminology conference, and it was in New Orleans, and speaking to colleagues who weren't vegan and wherever they'd been, and they were just couldn't believe that all of these different places that I'd been to, because I'd been trying to find these vegan restaurants. So I think it does mean that you can go to the same city as people and have totally different experiences, because you're going off here, there and everywhere, and I love that. I love that it takes you a bit further out and you experience things in a different cities in a different way to other people. But I think so. I do recognise that it can be, but I've still got lots of friends in rural North Wales who are vegan and manage to access the foods that they need. So I think supermarkets are much better now. So I think it is possible for people to.
Yeah, and I think
access those
food
things.
is the ultimate connector, isn't it? Food, it really does bring people together. I guess our hopeful restaurant conversation just now brings us nicely into our final bit of the episode, which is, first of all, very excitingly, you've got a new book coming out this year. Can you tell us a bit about that? But also, we are asking all of our guests to give a hopeful vision of 2050, because I feel like it's so easy for anyone to just think about the future and think about these negativities. There's going to be wildfires, everyone's going to be hungry, there's going to be water shortages, but I feel like we need to sort of try to imagine and develop a hopeful vision of the future and what can go right. So can you tell us a bit about your hopeful book and your hopeful vision?
I love that ending. It's so important, isn't it? And that's one of the things for me as well. You don't want to make people sort of scare people and put people off. So I tried to do that in this book, but the next book, which is called An Intersectional Analysis of the Relationship Between Anthropogenic Climate Change and Atrocity Crimes, Life on Earth is in Crisis. Now that doesn't sound very hopeful, does it, or positive? But bear with me. So and interestingly, in doing that book, because it is focused so much on climate change, I have really had to engage with some of the more positive elements. And interestingly, in doing the research for that book, I've come across some really interesting other research. And part of that, I've been thinking about this idea of sacrificial zones and expendable communities and projects of abandonment. So one of the things that I'm keen to sort of avoid is this idea that we have these expendable or pollutable communities that we just leave to perish. But also, I think within the context of climate change, I'm really keen that we don't embrace these kind of projects of abandonment. And what I mean by that is things like, these fantasies of escape. So Elon Musk's idea of like the rocket ship or these kind of climate change bunkers that people have. Here, and sort of following other writers like Thaler, I think it's really important to think about Donna Haraway's idea of staying with the trouble. And so actually what this means is that we should be staying with the climate change world rather than trying to ponder or escape from it.
Yeah.
And likewise, I think when doing the research for this book, you engage with a lot of stuff about the Anthropocene, which again can be very negative. It's all about, humans' damage to the earth. But I think there are some really nice regenerative possibilities that we can embrace when we think about the Anthropocene. And I think we can see it as as an opportunity to reimagine our relationship with the human and more than human world. So rather than seeing it as something pessimistic, we can think about rights of nature. And if we try and move away from anthropocentrism towards a more pluriversal worldview, which is about celebrating, reciprocal and relational and embedded relationships between humans and the more than human world, I think that's where my focus is. And in the book, my real focus is on adopting this multi-species action plan around climate change. So thinking about justice for everybody who is impacted by climate change, but doing it in a way that, just doesn't have this idea of these communities that we leave behind, or these sacrificial zones where we just leave people, or where we're so focused on escape and abandonment, that we all come together and try to sort of work towards this idea of a multi-species climate justice. So that's where I'm at with the final book, despite the title saying life on Earth is in crisis. There is hope within that crisis.
There's hope within the human world,
yes.
the Anthropocene world.
Yes.
I think the new BBC Natural History Unit documentary series on Asia did a really good job of kind of showing that human animal world, and kind of, it's not amazing, but it's working kind of thing.
I'll have to catch that. I haven't seen that.
It's really good, because it shows like a tiger, how like the tiger's adapted to come out only at night, when then it walks the same paths as the people during the day. It's really good.
I find all this sort of shape-shifting stuff really interesting with non-human animals and their response. It's fascinating, isn't it? But I think that's how we'll get people involved, isn't it? And that's the final chapter of the book, where it just focuses on how do we achieve this intersectional climate justice across all of those, species, ecosystems, humans, and again going back to this idea of across race, gender, species. So hopefully it's a positive ending.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to me today, Stacey. It's been amazing. It's been so informative, and I hope people have learnt something from this.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. This podcast is brought to you from the Creative Futures Research Centre and the Sustainability Development Unit at the University of Greenwich. So, from all of us here, see you next time.